In the bitter cold winter of 1924, the Soviet people pondered their future amid an outpouring of grief. Vladimir Illich Lenin, the man who had willed the Soviet Union into existence and steered it through its traumatic first years, was dead.
Against expectation, this man adapted from being a revolutionary chieftain of a small faction to being the leader of a new revolutionary state, the first socialist state in history. There can be no doubt about the massive historical impact of Lenin.
This is a very complicated guy, you know. You can't grab him in one word or in one picture. He is extremely rigid in one situation. He is extremely flexible in another situation. He is extremely humane in one situation. If he needs terror, he goes for it.
To create the utopian world he envisioned, Lenin did what he thought he had to. His violent seizure of power and the harsh measures he took to hold on to it inspired generations of revolutionaries and dictators. Brilliant and driven, Lenin wanted to change history. He did, but not in the way he expected. Born in a provincial Russian town in 1870, Vladimir Illich Lenin grew up in a prosperous family of educators and reformers. He was one of the lucky few. Most Russians were illiterate peasants who'd only recently been freed from slavery. The largest nation on Earth, late 19th century Russia was probably the most unequal society in Europe. For 300 years, the Romanov dynasty had maintained absolute control over its vast empire. During Lenin's childhood, Russia began a mad scramble to catch up with industrialized Western Europe, building huge factories and transcontinental railroads at great human cost. In the process, it created a class of brutalized, angry industrial workers. Add to the mix the small, educated middle class to which Lenin's family belonged, and Russia had a recipe for revolution.
The intelligentsia, the educated elite, were looking for ways to reform, to save their country, to serve their people, and yet had no avenues, no conduits through which they could do it. And so, because there was no parliament, because there were no open press, at least a fraction of that intelligentsia turned to the weapon of the weak, revolutionary terror.
One of these young terrorists was Alexander Ulyanov, a brilliant university student and Lenin's older brother. In 1887, Alexander joined a group of idealistic bunglers plotting to assassinate the Tsar. They were caught. In a bid to save the others' lives, Alexander claimed responsibility and was hanged. His entire family was devastated, but instead of offering support, friends and neighbors turned their backs on them.
It hardened Lenin. It hardened his heart against not just the monarchy, but also the middle classes and the upper classes in his little town when he experienced this ostracism of his whole family. So he hated old Russia. He wanted a new revolutionary Russia from that day forward.
As Lenin came of age, Russian revolutionaries were increasingly turning from ineffective homegrown terrorism to the ideas of German philosopher Karl Marx. Like all socialists, Marx believed in cooperation, not competition. But he didn't stop there. He created a radical offshoot of socialism he called communism. Writing in the mid-1800s, while the Industrial Revolution was pulling millions of Europe's poor from fields into factories, Marx showed how business owners oppressed workers. In his booklet, The Communist Manifesto, he predicted that one day workers would come out on top.
And that reassured these very depressed revolutionaries that Russia too could change. It turns out, according to Marxism, that it's the workers, the industrial urban workers, who are the vanguard of the revolution and not the peasants.
The Marxist vision of a workers' utopia and Russia's violent revolutionary tradition came together in the young firebrand, Lenin.
Lenin used the term the dictatorship of the proletariat, which he derived from Karl Marx. And Marx didn't necessarily mean that it would be a dictatorship as we know it, but Lenin did. Lenin meant literally that a dictatorship would be, should be, a dictatorship, that it should deprive the upper and middle classes of the vote and of civil rights, that it should behave severely to any sign of opposition to that dictatorship using terror. So Lenin believed in the dictatorship of the proletariat literally.
Relentless Tsarist injustices only fed Lenin's resolve. A young lawyer defending industrial workers, he read and wrote about revolution in his free time. Inevitably, he was arrested, and in late 1895 started down the well-worn path of many Russian revolutionaries: prison, Siberia, and exile abroad. For over a decade, Lenin crisscrossed Europe, always one step ahead of Tsarist agents. He wrote and published clandestine articles, newspapers, and books to be smuggled back home to Russia, and attended endless meetings with other exiles. Sick of perpetual talk and little action, by the turn of the century, Lenin took matters into his own hands. He became a revolutionary leader.
He wasn't introspective, he just assumed that the revolution would go wrong if he weren't to be its leader.
It all came together in 1902 with his pamphlet, What is to be Done? A guidebook for revolutionary leadership, it literally made his name. Born Vladimir Illich Ulyanov, he used a series of pseudonyms to avoid arrest. What is to be Done was signed Lenin.
He was surrounded by intellectuals who knew how to speak, but they didn't organize. The problem was to go to the folk, to go to the workers, organize cells, fight the police, learn weaponry, and especially techniques of organization. What is to be done? The answer is actually organize, 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 because he meant business.
This little pamphlet, What is to be Done, is extraordinarily important. Lenin's conception of the party, which would become the Communist Party, was of a small group of professional revolutionaries who would be like generals leading this army.
The new revolutionary leader practiced what he preached. He broke away from the main Russian Socialist Party to form his own action-oriented party, the Bolsheviks, and turned on his former allies. His aim, he said, was not to correct the mistake of the opponent, but to destroy him, to wipe his organization off the face of the earth.
He really was a revolutionary fanatic, but it was his belief that if he got a small core of followers, then eventually the situation would turn in his favor, and that workers would come into the party in droves. And if he had the doctrine right and the policy right, then the revolution would follow. And history proved this to be correct.
But first, there was a false alarm. In 1905, Tsarist troops fired on a peaceful demonstration. The attack shocked and angered Russians from all levels of society and forced a reluctant Tsar to set up a weak parliament. While many Russians began to hope reform was possible, the thought of reform instead of revolution infuriated Lenin.
He was an extremely nervous person and very highly strung. He seemed to be on duty all the time. He lived a very Spartan life. He did not have any luxuries in his life, very little relaxation.
He was extraordinarily fussy, even about the placing of pencils on his desk, and if anyone interfered with this, they were in trouble. And he never left his desk without making sure that all of the pencils were freshly sharpened for the very next day. His books were always in order. Everything about his life had to be in order so that he could give his life to the revolution.
Lenin told a friend,
I can't listen to music too often. It makes me want to say a lot of sweet nonsense and stroke the heads of people who live in this filthy hellhole and yet create such beauty. But you can't stroke anyone's head today. You get your hands cut off. Now you have to beat them on the head. Beat them without mercy.
What he was trying to say, I think, was we mustn't allow ourselves to get soft. We mustn't allow our compassion, our emotions, to turn our head from what is necessary to do to make the revolution. For after all, revolution is a violent event. It's a war. Revolution is best understood as a war.
it took a war, the First World War, to bring on Russia's revolution, and even then, not right away. In 1914, Tsarist Russia proudly marched west to Europe's battlefields. Its confidence was soon shattered.
The war went very badly, and the economy had not been equipped to fight modern warfare. It was not able to produce the weapons. There were growing food shortages and economic shortages in the rear, so that by 1916, everybody from the top to the bottom of Russian society acknowledged that it was the regime's fault.
They cannot run the war, they cannot run the country anymore, and therefore this thing is waiting for a little push.
February 23rd, 1917, International Women's Day. In the capital, Petrograd, a group of women demanding bread set out on one more of many demonstrations held that winter.
The Women's March for Bread did not have to lead to a revolution. What turned the tide was that the soldiers in the garrison lost their nerve. They opened fire. And that caused a mutiny among other sections of the army that had seen what their comrades had done. They went back to their garrisons and said, no, the time has come to join the revolution.
On March 2nd, the Tsar took the nation by surprise and abdicated his throne. Aristocrats, businessmen, and politicians scrambled to hold the country together. They formed what became known as the Provisional Government. Outside the palace walls and across the vast empire, workers took over their factories, peasants took over their fields, and soldiers refused to obey their officers. Overnight, workers' and soldiers' committees, known in Russian as Soviets, sprang up. At first, the Soviets and the Provisional Government cooperated.
The Soviet represented what was called the streets, or the democracy. They represented the people. The Provisional Government represented those who had been in office or in the parliament already. Neither one could have their way without the assent of the others.
With Russia still at war, the revolution was spreading like wildfire. But Lenin, exiled for over a decade, was stuck in Switzerland with the quickest way home through enemy territory, Germany. The Germans, hoping he'd weaken Russia's war effort, offered Lenin safe passage home. He accepted their offer and their money.
Lenin was an opportunist, you could say, or better to say, a pragmatist. He would use any means necessary to reach the goal of making a socialist revolution in Russia. If it meant taking money from the enemy, he's not going to serve that enemy, but he's going to use that money to make the revolution.
On April 4th, 1917, 1 month after the Tsar's abdication, Lenin's special private train arrived in Petrograd to find the Provisional Government, the Soviets, and the revolutionary parties working together.
Everyone expected he'd behave like all the other returning revolutionaries and make friends with all the rest of them. Instead of which, he got up and he denounced them all for supporting the Provisional Government and called for the overthrow of that Provisional Government. he was thought to be a madman.
Determined to topple the elites, Lenin arrived with two simple slogans: peace, land, and bread, and all power to the Soviets.
This was a revolutionary statement within the Bolshevik Party, who tried to shut him up. It was an embarrassment to most of the Bolsheviks. But actually, to the rank and file of the party, it immediately began to make sense. Their idea was, why not take power now? We can take power now. Let's take it. And that's essentially what Lenin was saying.
Not everyone could hear exactly what he was saying even, but crowds responded very, very positively to the sheer intensity which he managed to communicate to any audience.
By July, Petrograd's street crowds were ready for action, but Lenin's Bolsheviks were not. Sailor and worker Soviets staged a massive armed demonstration demanding a Soviet-run government. Lenin tried to call it off.
This was a desperate moment, but at the last minute he did back the crowd. This moment failed. Troops loyal to the government came into the city, put down this revolt. Lenin was left high and dry. The government claimed that he had orchestrated this event.
And they put out a warrant for him, and he had to flee into the underground, into hiding, into Finland.
But by midsummer, the provisional government began playing into the exiled Lenin's hands. World War I was taking an horrific toll. People demanded peace, but the government kept fighting a losing war. People demanded land, but the government refused to redistribute land until the war was over, and maybe not even then. While the government seemed paralyzed, the Bolsheviks were on the move, into the leadership of Soviets big and small across the nation.
They took over by virtue of their organizing ability, their agitational ability, and the power of their political platform, which was very appealing. Land, bread, and peace. It was very simple, but it represented the aspirations of the mass of the common people in Russia in 1917.
A National Congress of Soviets was due to meet in Petrograd in late October. The provisional government was collapsing, and almost everyone expected the Soviets to announce a peaceful transition of power. But Lenin had other plans. Still in Finland, he shaved his beard and mustache, then snuck back into Petrograd in disguise. He told the Bolsheviks it was time to attack.
Others thought, let's wait until this Congress meets, and it will declare Soviet power, and we can come to power relatively peacefully. And Lenin resisted that. He said, no, we must launch the revolution immediately. We must seize power by arms. And why? He said, because if we wait, we will lose this moment. History, he said, will not forgive us.
But the other Bolshevik leaders hesitated. On October 24th, with crowds filling the streets and an arrest warrant still on his head, Lenin set off for Bolshevik Party headquarters in a building called the Smolny Institute. It was the night before the Congress of Soviets convened.
He's apprehended on the way by police, who fail to recognize him. They think he's a tramp, and they let him pass. So it's only, if you like, that sheer accident of history that allows Lenin to come through to the Smolny, say, we must seize power now. And by force of his argument and personality and leadership in the party, that seizure of power takes place at the 11th hour. No Lenin, no October Revolution.
The next night, as the Congress met, Bolshevik foot soldiers called Red Guards marched into the poorly protected Winter Palace, seat of the provisional government. They arrested the few remaining officials. The violent overthrow Lenin demanded turned out to be practically bloodless.
We tend to think of 1917 as having had two revolutions. The February one that pulled down the Romanov dynasty, and the October Revolution, which replaced the provisional government with the Soviet government. But in reality, there were thousands of revolutions Villages started to rule themselves. Towns and cities started to rule themselves. The place was awash with revolutions. And what happened in October 1917 was that finally a party came to power that was going to pull all of these revolutions together. And that was the genius of Lenin, to be able to say to workers, peasants, soldiers and sailors, we want what you want.
Lenin's uncanny sense of timing, his intellectual prowess, and his ability to make tough decisions amid chaos were unparalleled.
He's a political strategist. And a political strategist of a high class, because he operates all the time in a situation in the dark. You don't know what will happen 15 minutes later. All the time, the situation is changing and it is clouded. And it is here that he works like nobody else. That is Lenin, and that's an art. I don't know of another figure like that.
6 months after he stepped off a train in Petrograd, a seemingly powerless fanatic, Lenin had almost single-handedly started a second revolution, which placed him at the head of the world's first socialist state. Officially a Soviet-run government, in fact, Lenin's Bolshevik party was in charge. The Bolsheviks announced they would call for a constituent assembly to draft a constitution. But first, they held national elections for the assembly representatives.
The Bolsheviks had said, before they seized power, that they were the only party who would hold the constituent assembly elections. But they assumed that by the time that the elections were held, that most people would be voting for the Bolsheviks. This was an absolutely catastrophic error. Actually, less than a quarter of the population voted Bolshevik. And anyone who knew Lenin knew exactly what he would do. He let the Constituent Assembly meet, and then he closed it down a day later.
It never met again. That was one of the great blows against the move toward democracy in Russia.
Democracy would have been difficult to conserve in Russia in late 1917. The fact is, however, that a party came to power under Lenin that had no interest in democracy at all. Lenin spat the word democracy out.
At the moment he takes power with his party, they have nothing. Not an army, not an industry, not any food. Niente. A place I read, Lenin says, when we took power, we had nothing but slogans.
Lenin immediately made good on some of the slogans. He announced that land would pass into the use of those who cultivate it, and pledged to get Russia out of the war. But he also imposed Tsarist-era tactics: secret police, press censorship, and state terror. Early targets of Lenin's wrath were wealthy peasants called kulaks, who were hoarding grain. He ordered they be made an example.
Hang no fewer than 100 known kulaks, rich men, bloodsuckers. Do it in such a way that for hundreds of kilometers around, the people might see, tremble, know, shout. They are strangling. Yours, Lenin.
Lenin truly believed that eventually a communist society would be constructed where there would be no government, there would be no army, there would be no coercion of any kind. But the way he conducted himself gives a lot of sign that underneath this conceptual apparatus of utopian thought, there was a very brutal psychology at work.
Lenin's Russia was in crisis. World War I raged on, and Germany was gobbling up Russian territory. Desperate, the new government moved its capital to Moscow, farther east. Anarchy was widespread, and millions were starving. No one, not even the Bolsheviks, expected their government to last. They had to get out of the war somehow. In March 1918, they abandoned their European allies and signed a separate peace treaty with Germany.
The Bolsheviks, to hold on to power, have to sign away a third of the country's territory, about half of its industrial resources, and much of its breadbasket in the Ukraine to the Germans, which of course was much more than anyone had bargained for back in October 1917.
This was thought to be an action that involved colluding with imperialism, with German imperialism. So it took a mountain of determination, a mountain of persuasion, a mountain of filibustering by this one man, Lenin, to persuade a reluctant party that if they didn't sign this separate peace, they would be signing away the October Revolution.
But peace with Germany would trigger war at home, civil war. For the next 3 years, the Soviet government's Red Army faced off against a White Army of resentful officers hoping to restore the Tsar. Anger over the treaty only added fuel to the fire.
There was terror on both sides. There was the Red Terror against their enemies, and there was even more terror on the White side. And they particularly carried out anti-Semitic pogroms against Jews who they felt were supporters of the Bolsheviks.
The government not only won over many peasants with land giveaways, it regained much of its territory when Germany lost the First World War. And its 5 million-man Red Army, led by Lenin's ally, Leon Trotsky, eventually hunted down the scattered White Army. By 1921, the new Soviet government finally prevailed, but Russia itself was almost destroyed in the process. Famine gripped much of the country, and Russia teetered again on the edge of collapse. Lenin, the hardline communist, made yet another astonishingly pragmatic decision. To save his revolution, he turned to capitalism.
We have to retreat now, and he called it a retreat. Instead of trying to build socialism right away, which we can't do, we're going to build state capitalism. We're going to open up markets. We're going to have a private industry. If we don't make some kind of compromise alliance with the peasantry, they will overthrow us. They are the majority.
And this got the wheels of the economy moving, and it started regenerating the market in such a way that people started living a little better. And that took the sting out of the protest against the Bolshevik government.
The iron-willed revolutionary leader's ability to compromise had rescued his revolution again. His new nation named itself the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, and the Bolsheviks officially became the Communist Party, the only political party in the country. By 1922, the 52-year-old Lenin had dodged many bullets. Even the bullets that struck him in an assassination attempt failed to kill him. But Lenin finally faced a challenge his ferocious intellect and drive could not overcome. In May 1922, he suffered a serious stroke. More would follow. Government leaders and doctors ordered him to stop all work, but Lenin ignored them. Forced into semi-retirement by his illness, he began dictating a document later known as his Last Testament. Trying to reform the government, he advocated more freedom for peasants and ethnic minorities. And looking among his fellow communist leaders, the dying Lenin considered possible successors. He criticized them all, but specifically condemned Joseph Stalin, who'd begun amassing enormous power in his new position as General Secretary.
This, Lenin says, is a very bad guy in politics. Replace him, please.
This time, the inner circle rejected Lenin's advice. It was a profoundly tragic mistake. In the decades that followed, Stalin had all the other communist leaders murdered, along with millions of ordinary Soviet citizens, in a campaign called the Great Terror. He created a vast prison system known as the Gulag that kept millions more in slave labor for decades. And he violently forced Russia's peasants onto collective farms. He did all this and more in the name of Lenin and the revolution.
A lot of people think that there was an early golden period of the October Revolution, followed by a dark age of Stalinism. In fact, there are lots of similarities between the two periods. Lenin founded the one-party state. Lenin passed on the doctrine that terror should be used, and dictatorship also, to consolidate the revolutionary state. Now, that's not Stalinism, that's Leninism. And that was a legacy that Lenin bequeathed to Stalin.
The man whose harsh, stirring words and deeds had changed the world spent his last months unable to speak or move. Lenin died on January 21st, 1924. The grief expressed at Lenin's funeral was real and brought the Russian people together in a way that nothing else had since February 1917. Stalin ordered Lenin's body embalmed and put on display in Moscow's Red Square, probably the last thing Lenin would have wanted.
Lenin leaves behind a very important destructive legacy. Essentially, Lenin founds a new type of party, a party which is really a military vanguard for the violent seizure of power, which will then organize some sort of revolution from the top. And this becomes an inspiration to all socialist movements. To some extent, it also becomes an inspiration to the Nazis and to the fascists.
There are, of course, many people who admire Lenin for his goals, that is, trying to create a socialist society of greater equality and social justice and empowerment of working people. But at the same time, there are also critics who argue that his means to carry out that goal, those means corrupted, tainted those goals. And Lenin may not have understood the intimate connection between what means you use and the ends that you desire. It's not that easy in humankind to create good things through bad means, whether it be socialism or democracy.